There's no place like theCUBE.
Family, it's your favorite queer radio personality, Anna DeShawn here, and it is March, which means it's Women's History Month, and we have got to queer it out. Today, this week, we are honoring and remembering Bobbie Lea Bennett. And of course, I got my homie, Amanda, your favorite queer public historian. What's happening, Amanda?
Hello.
Hello, we've been having a great time this month.
We have. This is fun.
And now, I know y'all probably have not heard about Bobbie Lea Bennett, but we are about to get all up into her business today. And her story is, I was like, what you say, Amanda? That's what y'all gonna be saying when you watch this, okay? So how about we start in the beginning? In the beginning.
In the beginning, there was like, no. Bobbie Lea Bennett is a trans disability rights activist. She was born in 1947 in Louisiana as one of 8 siblings. And she was born with something called osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bone disease. So she spent her entire childhood and adolescence undergoing really painful surgeries and medical procedures. And she was a wheelchair user from childhood.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is an important piece to her story. As we learn more family, child, Bobbie Lea Bennett was not one to be messed with. And
she's a wheelchair user from childhood. And that's a really big part of her story, because everything else that happened in her life was framed not necessarily by the fact that she was disabled, but the fact that the world was not suited for people with disabilities. It still really isn't today, but it was much worse then.
And it was a big part of her activism.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to talk about her trans identity, but we cannot ever forget her disability justice in the midst of all of this as well, which I think is a really wonderful pairing, because in the queer community, we absolutely ought to be the people uplifting disability justice.
Absolutely.
Every time that we're talking about queer history. And Bobbie Lea Bennett she's like a beautiful combo of both of these things, where she was doing both at the same time, just by being exactly who she was.
Yeah. And the big government fight that she's known for, which we'll get to, the reason that she could fight that fight was specifically because she was a person with disabilities. So it's all super important context. But before she was fighting with the federal government, she got married when she was 18. She was working as a dental assistant and had to drag herself in her wheelchair up 2 flights of stairs every single morning to get to work, because this was decades before the ADA was signed. So there were no accommodations necessary.
I can't even imagine how hard that was. But also, I can't imagine how strong she was from having to do that. And
I just think about the fact that the thing about osteogenesis imperfecta is it means that your bones are sort of like chalk, like the consistency of your bones. So your bones break really easily. And so I'm just trying to imagine the physics of having a condition that makes your bones really brittle and having to drag yourself up 2 flights of stairs every single day to get to work. Like, I'm just trying to wrap my head around that.
Those 2 things don't even make sense.
No. And so while she was going through all of this, she was also really, really starting to question her gender. She was living as a man, which was the gender she was assigned at birth. She was married to a woman. But shortly after she got married, she went to a psychiatrist because what she described as a feeling of disconnect between her mind and her body. And the psychologist she saw diagnosed her with transsexualism, which was the diagnosis at the time. Today we would say perhaps she was experiencing gender dysphoria, that she was a trans person, but the diagnosis she received in the moment was that she was a transsexual, which freaked her out. Bobbie was.
I bet it did. She was married. She was already living at a time that wasn't accessible to her at all. She had a disease. She had many surgeries growing up. Child, how much can one person be like, what you say?
And she was Catholic. So it was a lot. It was a lot. It really kind of like sent her into a tailspin because she felt so much shame for her gender dysphoria. But she also she sort of didn't want to be in the world anymore, but because she was Catholic, she also didn't want to take the steps to remove herself from the world because that would have, in her view, sentenced her to an eternity in hell, and she didn't want to deal with that. So she was in a really terrible place. But even while she was going through all of that, she still was doing things like, she tells this story of going to a store and buying a pink shirt and a black skirt and a bunch of makeup and telling the clerk that it was for her sister when she paid. Then going home and like putting it all on and feeling this sense of like peace and calm that she was sort of starting to look on the outside the way she felt in the inside.
And I can't even imagine the store clerk at the time, because I mean we're talking like what, 1960.
Yeah, this would have been probably around 1966, 65, 66.
A man walking into a store buying all these women's products. Let me tell
A
you,
man in a wheelchair,
right,
going into a store,
right,
buying all of these like just.
Child, what
so
they
many.
weren't doing was doing that. Okay, I can imagine the clerk looking at him sideways. At
And
the
this is
time,
in, like,
for sure.
This is in I want to say it's Slidell, I think Slidell, Louisiana, which is like not a very tiny town, but certainly not a big town. So like there's just a lot happening.
I feel like the people was whispering. Okay,
Probably. But I guess on the
Louisiana.
upside, like they were probably already whispering because she was a wheelchair user. So she was sort of in this really difficult place where she was sort of trying to wrestle with who she was. But also, she was a newlywed, her wife was pregnant. And then unfortunately, her wife was killed in a car accident when she was 7 months pregnant with their first child. So both Bobbie's wife and their unborn child died in that car accident, which really sent Bobbie sort of into a tailspin. She actually ended up getting remarried very quickly to another woman, and then that only lasted 24 hours. And then Bobbie was like, okay, this is, I have to go live as my authentic self or I'm not going to make it. So she left Louisiana and went to San Diego. And so by the early 70s, she's living in San Diego as her authentic self, as Bobbie Lea Bennett.
And what a big move. Louisiana to San Diego. Those are two different worlds.
Yeah.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I don't know why San Diego, honestly. It's not in any of her interviews why she picked there, but I don't know, maybe she had friends there.
Maybe she did. I like me some San Diego. Okay, the boys be outside making the tortillas. I am about the San Diego life. I think Bobbie made a great choice.
I know. Me too. So she was living in San Diego as Bobbie Lea Bennett, and at the time in the 70s, there were very few clinics in the United States who offered what we would now call gender affirming care. Sure. It wasn't, I mean, I won't say it's easy to access today, especially recently, but it is much easier to access today than it was in the 70s. So in 1974, she gets accepted into the Gender Identity Clinic in Galveston, Texas. And she was so excited when she got accepted into the clinic. She told a reporter she went out and bought 50 pairs of earrings to celebrate.
Okay, first off, I don't know what Bobbie's family did, okay, but she had surgeries when she was little, wheelchair access, moving across the country, and now things like buying 50 pairs of earrings. I don't know what they did. I don't know where she got her money from. I can imagine it wasn't because she was a dental hygienist at one point. So
no,
it seems like she has some money somewhere. Maybe not wealth, but it was definitely okay.
She couldn't have had much though, because, and this will be key when she starts a fight with the government, Bobbie was classified as disabled by the federal government, which meant she got disability payments from Social Security. And anyone who's ever had to deal with any sort of like payments from Social Security, and this was true at the time, like you cannot hold wealth if you receive disability payments. Like it's one of the reasons that people who are disabled very often can't get married, because if they get married, that will change their like net worth, and then they'll lose their disability benefits from the government. It is completely screwed up. Wow. So I'm a little unclear about, I don't know, maybe she had generous friends, maybe she had money in her mattress she wasn't reporting to government. I don't know. God bless her. She went out and bought a bunch of earrings to celebrate.
I love that though. I love that. That's the Barbie thing to do, right?
Seriously. So yeah, her nickname was Barbie Doll because she just loved Barbies. And of course, doll is a very common term for trans women. And she loved Barbies. At one point she drove a Barbie pink car. Yeah, so it was a very Barbie thing to do, to go out and buy a bunch of earrings. But the process with this gender clinic in Galveston was that she had to spend 4 years living her life as a woman, undergoing a battery of psychological and medical tests, and she had to go through feminization classes. So here's the thing about being trans in the United States in like the 60s and 70s. You were still expected to comply with heteronormative standards, both of sexuality and gender expression. So if you were a trans woman, at the end of your transition, you were expected to physically pass for a woman, and you were expected to be a straight woman. So although there was in the US, sort of an increasing amount of access to, gender confirming care, it was still very binary and very gendered. So if you were a trans man, at the end of your transition, you were expected to physically pass as a man and to be a straight man, to be in romantic and sexual relationships with women. So there was literally no space in the middle for non-binary people, for people who sort of found themselves like somewhere on the spectrum between man and woman. Like you were either a man or you're a woman, and you could go from man to woman or woman to man, but you couldn't like hang out in the middle.
Yeah.
So Bobbie had to take classes about how to gesture like a woman, how to change her voice to speak more like a woman, to have a more sort of womanly vocal quality. So it was it was trans healthcare, but also like rigidly heteronormative.
Right. Exactly. And when you mentioned that part about your voice, family, I know it's a little off topic, but there's an organization actually called Undead Voices, which actually cares and helps trans folks with voice transition. Go check them out. It's super cool. The person that founded it, she's super cool. We got to talk with her at Creating Change. So go check out Undead Voices. She's actually offering some classes right now for free just because of all the hate that's happening in the country right now against our trans siblings. So go check out Undead Voices.
That is awesome.
It is really dope. You had to endure feminization classes.
Yeah, which, I mean, by all accounts in interviews, she loved. Like, she thought it was super fun to learn how to, gesture to be more like a woman, whatever. Like, Bobbie definitely saw herself as a binary woman, if that makes sense. Like, she was not interested in the middle ground where other people were. Like, she was definitely all the way over on the, like, male to female scale.
She was a high femme. I believe it. As a high femme, for sure.
So the final step, obviously, after, all of these years of testing and classes and all that, is what we would now call gender affirming surgery. At the time, it was called the sex change operation. And so Medicare had approved the cost of this surgery, because her team of doctors at the Galveston clinic had submitted it and Medicare approved it. And then Bobbie did an interview with a trans magazine. And in that magazine, she talked about her upcoming surgery and the fact that it was going to be covered by Medicare. Somehow that magazine article that went to this very specific trans audience got out more broadly. And the Social Security office started receiving phone calls and letters from people who were outraged that government money was being spent on gender affirming care. Does that sound familiar?
It seems like just yesterday.
Yeah. In fact, I think it was. Because, before people could yell about things on Twitter, they would call and email government offices to express their displeasure about things, which is still a good idea, by the way.
Call your letters. Yeah, it's all still important.
So then, Medicare rescinded their approval on March 23rd. of 1978. And then there was like a week of confusion, basically. So the director of Medicare at the time was a guy named Thomas M. Tierney. And so her approval was rescinded on the 23rd of March. On the 5th of March, Tierney appeared to make a statement saying that, oh, just kidding, it would be covered after all, as long as she had met the threshold, the government's threshold of living as a woman for a year. The standards for the clinic were different than like the federal standards, which were living as a woman for a year.
Okay.
And so then that was in the papers. And then 2 days later, he made another statement that was like, no, that's not what I said. You guys misunderstood me. The federal government would never cover gender affirming care. That's not a thing we're even thinking about or talking about. And it's so funny. Like, there's a series of news articles in the LA Times from the same reporter that's like every 2 days. He's like, looks like Bobbie's going to get her surgery. Nope, just kidding. Looks like she won't. Oh, maybe she will. Oops, nope. Like, it's just...
The comedy of it all.
Yeah. And so Bobbie was not having that. And as far as I can tell, so she decided she was going to drive cross country. She was going to drive herself to the White House and make someone listen to her and reverse this decision.
Okay.
And as far as I can tell, she like decided on the night of like April 7th or something, whatever the last day that Tierney made a statement was, and then left like a day or two later. She just like got it in her head and she was going to go.
It's been her spirit her whole life.
Yeah, pretty much. She was like, I am not dealing with this. And so there were a couple of things kind of working in Bobbie's favor.
Okay.
The first thing that was working in her favor at the time, because she managed to whip up a ton of like media and public interest in a very short amount of time. Mm-hmm. One, because she was just kind of a media genius and she knew what she was doing. But the country at the time was embroiled in this very big scandal about abuse of children with disabilities at a school called the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York. Mm. And this reporting had come out about really terrible things that I don't want to talk about that were being done to children with disabilities. So the protection of people with disabilities was really at the forefront of the national conversation at the time that this happened to Bobbie. So it was a thing people were like aware of and cared about and were fired up about. So that worked to her advantage. Mm. The other thing that worked to her advantage specifically is that Bobbie obviously was not the first one who'd had to fight Medicare to get her gender treatment covered, but Bobbie was unique because she was already classified as disabled by the federal government because of her brittle bone disease. So other trans people who wanted the government to, or needed the government to pay for their care, had to first make the case to the government that being trans was a disability and that they were eligible for disability coverage. And then once they made that case, then they could submit to have their care covered by Medicare. Obviously, this is an entire box of worms, right? Like having the government declare people who are trans as having a disability, like that's a big problem for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Some of which we're living out right now.
Ugh.
But Bobbie was classified as disabled for an entirely unrelated reason. Yes. So the only thing anyone had to consider when looking at Bobbie's case specifically was whether or not Medicare was obligated to cover gender affirming care. So it made her a really good test case, essentially, because the issue of whether or not being trans counts as a disability was off the table. She was already disabled.
Yeah. Which is a win, I think, for everybody that came after Bobbie Lea Bennett. Like this is like,
I mean, it made her like, it made her just the perfect test case for policymakers because it took one huge piece off the board entirely that nobody had to deal with. So anyway, so Bobbie decides she's going to drive to the White House and talk to President Carter because this is bullshit and she is not standing for it.
And can we talk a little bit about this drive? Okay. Yeah. Now, where is she starting from, Amanda? Is she started in San Diego?
In San Diego.
And she is driving to Washington, D.C.
It's a 39-hour drive.
As a person living with a disability and in a wheelchair.
Yes. So she drove using hand controls, which is how many people with disabilities still drive today. But it was driving long distance was not an insignificant undertaking for her, right? Because like transferring in and out of her wheelchair, like in and out of the car, having to spend nights in, roadside motels that are like to this day not terribly accessible to people with disabilities, especially wheelchair users. So like, in 1978, not great.
No. Yeah.
So yeah, this is a not insignificant undertaking, and she didn't go alone. She had like other people with her, but still, this was a big thing. While she was driving, so she had a CB radio in her car, and she loved to talk to truckers, and they loved her because she was, funny and flirty, and and she was like off on this sort of like crazy adventure. She actually met the man who would become her first husband over the CB, actually while she was driving back.
Wow.
So,
seriously?
but this is my favorite part. Her handle on the CB radio was Bionic Woman because of how much metal was in her body from all of the surgeries that she'd had.
So let me get this right. She's traveling 39 hours across country to just raise holy hell. Mm-hmm. On the way back from raising holy hell, she basically meets her first husband over this CB radio, being the Bionic Woman. Uh-huh. And the thing with CB radios, everybody can hear what she's saying, so they're just having a whole flirtatious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, this is Bobbie. The other thing that's amazing about this road trip is she packed 3 suitcases of clothes because Bobbie understood the importance of always looking your best when you are doing something that has a lot of media eyes trained on you.
This will be the Barbie part. Okay.
Yes. This is the Barbie part.
3 suitcases of luggage, and she was not alone. And we're going 39 hours, and we have to make stops. And we have a wheelchair. This is
a big undertaking. It was a really big undertaking. So she literally drove to the White House and asked to see President Carter, and the White House, unsurprisingly, was like, we will not be doing that. That's not how this works. Why don't you call and try and make an appointment? So she called a bunch of times and obviously like could not get through, and no one would give her an appointment to talk to the president.
Of course not.
I love the audacity. I love that she was like, I don't know, if I just show up at the gate, maybe they'll let me in. So
that's what we need out here. Unapologetic audacity. Okay.
Yes. So, and she was not to be deterred. She was like, all right, the president won't meet with me. I'm going to go to Baltimore, and I am going to drive to the home of Medicare Director Thomas M. Tierney. And she did. And she sat outside his home until he agreed to meet with her.
Do we know how long that was?
I've seen a whole bunch of different ranges from like, it was like a day or two. She sat out there for a whole week. Like, it's hard to say. It's, it's kind of like telling a story about a fish that you caught where it's like the fish was this big and this big and this big. But she sat out there for a significant amount of time, long enough that he finally was like, oh my God, I have to meet with her, so she'll just go away.
Yeah.
And so they met, and Bobbie said that Tierney was cordial, but like wouldn't give her any answers, wouldn't reverse his decision. All he would say to her was that he had a committee like working on the issue of gender reassignment. So she left disappointed, right? Like she'd made this huge gesture essentially and got nothing for it.
Yeah.
Until she got home. And when she arrived home from her road trip, she found a check from the Social Security Administration for $4,053 waiting for her.
It's a very
specific amount of money. And here's the thing. The letter that came with the check said, whoops, we realized that we've been underpaying your monthly stipend since 1975, so we're just going to square you up in one lump sum. And so basically the letter said she should have been receiving $315 a month from the government, but had only been receiving $185 a month since 1975. So here's all that money we forgot to pay you. Whoops. And this definitely has nothing to do with your gender reassignment surgery. This was definitely just a clerical error and has nothing to do with anything else. Weirdly, that clerical error was just about the amount of money she needed to proceed with her surgeries as planned. So she did.
1 second, Amanda. Let me get this right. somebody took the time to figure out the amount that was different from 185 to 315 to come out with the exact dollar amount that she needed to cover her gender affirming.
I mean, pretty close.
I'm
Here's
back.
the thing. I think we all know the US government is famous for being super generous when they screw up and sending you lots of money. Like, that is definitely a thing the US government does, right?
No.
Anyway, just a clerical error, nothing to see here. And it sort of was like, it ended up in an everybody wins situation.
Wow.
The director of Medicare didn't have to change his opinion. All of the members of the public who were angry got to say that their tax dollars had not gone to covering Bobbie's surgery. And Bobbie got a check from Social Security that covered her surgery. So kind of everybody won.
Kinda. And I'm glad we get to set the record straight now. But okay, go Bobbie. Okay.
Yeah, and it did ultimately, eventually, Tierney did make it clear. Actually, I'm not sure if it was Tierney or the person immediately after him, but like not too long after this, Medicare did put an official policy in place that covered gender affirming care. Although I will say that the fact that the policy was in place does not necessarily mean that it was straightforward for people to get approval for those things. But like eventually, partly because of the, changing opinions in the country and partly because of Bobbie Lea Bennett's very high profile road trip, this did change Medicare policy.
Because she decided she was going to go for 72 hours.
Literally just going to go knock on President Carter's door.
And I'm just going to have the audacity to do
I
this
know.
and fight for myself. I mean, this is the type of fight, right, that we all need to just bottle up. This type of fierceness.
Yeah.
There's just no fear here.
The thing that's so cool about Bobbie Lea Bennett, and this is true for the rest of her life after this big road trip, is like, this kind of wasn't unusual or spectacular to her. You know what I mean? Like, she just was like, well, I've been screwed by the government and no one will listen to me. So who is in charge of the government? The president is in charge of the government. I'm going to go talk to him.
Wow.
You know? She met her first husband driving back over the CB radio. His name was Stuart. And they married in like 4 months after she had her surgery in Galveston. And then they had a son by surrogate in 1981. Her sister Dottie acted as their surrogate. And, it was like a little bit of a news article in like a couple of papers. So Bobbie Lea Bennett was sort of still enough of a known name that when that happened, it was noteworthy. My favorite thing about the coverage of them having their child by surrogacy is like, first of all, everyone was super cool with it. Like, there's just no, like, her sister was like, yes, absolutely, I will be your surrogate. The OBGYN, who was named Dr. Lou, gave a quote to one newspaper saying, none of us are looking to make this thing sensational. Mrs. Bennett has survived a lot of things, surgery, getting married, and now being prepared to raise a baby. But that doctor also went on, because they did not actually tell the OBGYN at the beginning of Dottie's pregnancy that she was a surrogate for Bobbie and Stuart. So that doctor did not know the relationship among Dottie, Bobbie, and Stuart until pretty late in Dottie's pregnancy.
Wow.
There's definitely an interview where the doctor was like, I was a little shocked, but it's kind of cool. Like, actually referred to the baby as a premium baby.
Premium,
because of the like specific care that was taken in like having this baby. So yeah, so they had a son by surrogacy in 1981.
How progressive.
I know. And like, but again, and it wasn't that big a deal. Like, the news articles were like page 25, like an eighth of a column, it just wasn't. If there had been Twitter, it would have blown up into like a whole big nasty thing. But it was just sort of like, hey, this thing happened. And the tone of the coverage wasn't anything other than, hey, this is kind of interesting. Look, here's what's happened, since she had her surgery and like drove to the White House. She has gotten married. They're having a baby,
Yeah. And we're moving on to the next story.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's the way
And
it ought to be.
She spent her whole life being a disability advocate. She worked a bunch of different jobs. She was a licensed cosmetologist. She worked as a private investigator for a lawyer. I'm trying to picture Bobbie Lea Bennett doing stakeouts as a PI in her Barbie pink car. Like, that can't.
I was sitting here thinking that, Amanda, and I'm like, I don't know how that worked out.
Must have been driving someone else's car. I don't know.
Had to be. Everybody in that town, wherever she was, knew where she was coming.
Right?
What?
When she lived in Austin, Texas, she had a public access talk show called Barbie's Talk Show. And that entire show was about the accessibility challenges faced by people with disabilities. So this would have been before the ADA was signed into law, because that was in 1990. And so this show was probably in like the mid 80s. But it was entirely dedicated to talking about the access issues faced by people with disabilities.
I mean, everywhere. The more I learn about Bobbie Lea Bennett, I mean,
she was so cool. Also, just incredibly fashionable. Just especially in the 80s with like the big, like perfectly just feathered hair. And, like, just... yeah, I mean, she was just amazing. I think that her story is so important, not just because she was a trans person, not just because she was a person with disabilities, but because she was both. And that intersection allowed her to really force an issue that had kind of been at a stalemate, for decades. Oh, she was also, by the way, I forgot to say, she was the first person with disabilities in the US to receive gender confirming surgery. So
the very first?
Yeah, she was the first, because people were very concerned, right? Because that
no, you don't say.
That kind of surgery is hard on the body. Like, you will definitely hear stories from people who, especially people who had to go overseas and got like all their surgeries at the same time, and how hard that was on their bodies. So there were definitely some concerns that her body might not be up for this, but came through it like a champ.
I feel like these are the same concerns we hear today.
Yeah.
Like, and yet, it is one of the safest, most affirming surgeries. And that too is documented. That too is in the data. So she was just this woman who, at every stage of her life, I feel like, from childhood challenges to losing her wife at 20, right? And her baby, to then moving to San Diego, and then fighting for her identity and who she was. And I mean, it's just for like every stage of her life.
The thing that I think is so...
I'm fighting.
The thing I find so inspiring about Bobbie Lea Bennett in particular is that at every crossroads in Bobbie's life, she chose herself. Like, from the time her wife died.
Yeah. Every
time she reached any sort of major turning point, she chose herself. She chose to advocate for herself, for her ability to live authentically, for her ability to have a family, whatever it was. And I think that is important, because that, by choosing herself, by just existing in the world as herself, she opened so many doors for other people. And she just, provided a roadmap, right, for other people who were trans, other people who were living with physical disabilities. Like, she provided a view of another way, right, another life. And I think that's so important, especially now.
Wow. I mean, I think that's so profound what you just said. She chose herself. We have a problem with that. That is a hard thing to do, is to choose you over choosing someone else, or being a people pleaser, right? I think there are so many stages in Bobbie's life where she could have done something different to please everybody around her. And instead, she did the exact opposite and lived a life for herself. And
and that's not selfish, right? No. Like, to make sure that you are your best self, that like your well is full, like whatever metaphor you want to use, like that's not well, maybe it is a selfish choice, but it is but is the kind of selfish that leads to good in the world. Like, I know there's another word that I just can't think of right now, but
Self-preservation.
yeah. And it's the, it's the like put on your own oxygen mask before you help other people put on theirs. It's that same kind of thing. Like, by all accounts, Bobbie was this unbelievable well of energy and compassion and humor. And I don't think she could have been that had she not chosen herself at all of those like crucial junctures.
Absolutely. And her choosing herself is self-preservation. That is self-care. That is the lesson, family. I'm hoping that you all glean, yes, from her story, is that choosing
Driving to the White House is self-care. That's what I heard.
I'm not saying that. I ain't saying that, but
the FBI is going to be at my door any minute.
Okay. But the act in and of itself, yes. Oh, I love this. And I'm so glad that you wanted to bring her to light this month, Amanda.
Yeah, I love her story.
Heard of Bobbie Lea Bennett.
Yeah, I love her story. I covered her a couple years ago, and I was so glad to be able to do a deeper dive to do this video because I learned some new stuff. And yeah, I just like, especially at this moment in time in the American timeline, I just think she's really a shining beacon of how we can all move through the world, and also maybe just show up at the homes of agency heads who are screwing us over.
I'm not telling you to go do that. But
I am also, for legal reasons, not telling you to go do that.
But what I'm saying is, okay, but
it didn't work when she did it.
Family, I hope that you have enjoyed this video and this lesson about Bobbie Lea Bennett and self-preservation and self-care and choosing you right in this moment. I hope y'all have been locked in. Share this, yes, like the video. Tell a friend that you watched it. I mean, this is what it's all about. Us telling our stories and ensuring that everybody knows we were here. Because we've always been here.
And we have always been queer.
Period. Peace.